Welcome to the Krusty Fox, and today we're paying our respects to Season 2, Episode 5 of Sex and the City, entitled 4 Women and a Funeral. If this is your first time here, why not check out the playlist and the link on screen now to witness the whole mess from the very beginning. And don't forget to stay tuned until the end of this video for last week's top comments and this week's question. This time we join Carrie in her apartment as she rushes to get ready. But for once, she isn't ricocheting around in preparation for a disappointing appointment. Today, her little black dress is getting deployed at a funeral in Queens. The unfortunate subject of the event is Javier, a successful and well-known fashion designer. This apparently good friend of Carrie's fatally OD'd on smack, and while I'm not saying there's a correlation there, I do think it's at least worth looking into. The motley crew of fellow mourners from the island of misfit toys come decked out in what must have been bleeding edge fashion for the late 90s, but to look at them now you'd think you'd stumbled onto a street theatre production of Beetlejuice. Javier's sister Josefina, who our lying leads claim had a face like a blobfish licking piss off sandpaper just yesterday, today is giving share.
It's giving share.
It's another sign that we're not so much witnessing reality in this show as we are a version of it, as perceived by our central foursome. Think Doctor Strange after crippling budget cuts. As Samantha pursues Josefina to offer PR services for her new Javier House Foundation for Artsy Addicts, Charlotte has a runaway hat situation. It leads her to handsome widower Ned, like it's a version of the Feather from Forrest Gump, only interested in getting you laid. On the car ride home, and despite Samantha's warnings, Charlotte won't be swayed from going out with no-wife Ned, whose grief over his dead spouse seems to be getting her going. If she ever finds out about Grief Anonymous, she'll be able to sail down to their next meeting on a flash flood of her own making. Carrie, who has clearly been waiting several episodes for somebody to mention marriage, jumps at the opportunity to table Mr. Big's fear of commitment. When Charlotte correctly points out that Carrie was the one who dumped him, the only thing stopping her from getting a heel wedged into her eye socket is that Samantha happens to be in the way. On the Upper West Side, Miranda views a spacious new apartment. The real estate agent asks probing questions which probably speak to her concern over how many murders she'll have to disclose when the property next goes on the market. Wandering around with eyes like a cat on crack as she marvels at how much space must be available under the floorboards, Miranda agrees to buy the place. Carrie, meanwhile, proves that even dying won't put you beyond her reach if she can find a way to use you. She turns Javier's death into an excuse to consider her own mortality and so call Big. While her remaining brain cells desperately try to stop her, I'd like to draw your attention to the newspaper page opposite Javier's obituary. But sure, Carrie dying single is definitely a real issue. When she tells Big that she's just been to a funeral, he jokes that he's flattered that it made her think of him. Not yet, John. Not yet. She arranges to meet him for dinner that weekend, and in a definitely not insane move, immediately begins talking about how their relationship is now revived after it took 6 months to die. Overly attached girlfriend vibes aside, fans of Dates and Times might remember that 4 episodes ago, Charlotte said Carrie and Big had been together for a whole year. I get that continuity isn't a big deal for this production, but all I'm asking for is a post-it note in the writer's room or something. Anything. Samantha busies herself with securing funds for Javier House from investment banker Richard. He makes an incredibly lazy pass at her, and while Samantha isn't in need of charity, she also doesn't see why the foundation should be the only one to receive a donation from Dick. Unfortunately, his wife Sandy walks in just as he's preparing to invest heavily in Samantha's undercarriage. At lunch, Miranda vents about encountering a sexist banker while sorting out her mortgage, and Charlotte sagely informs her it's because property-owning women are off-putting to men. If it were 500 years earlier, I'm certain that Charlotte would have considered Henry VIII a bit of a fixer-upper when he was already 4 wives deep. The waitress returns with Samantha's card, politely informing her that due to Sandy Cranwell's vengeful social engineering, she and her money have been blacklisted. This leads to the ladies just getting up and leaving, which seems like an own goal for Sandy, considering that all she's done is bag them a free meal. Charlotte has drinks with Ned the Unwed, and finding herself ever more turned on by an emotional instability she's choosing to interpret as availability allows it to lead her all the way into his bed. There, she cradles him like a baby as he serves her generous helpings of gentleman's relish as a huge portrait of the last recipient looks on from the nightstand. And don't worry, it's not just you, everything about this is f***ing gross. Charlotte's chronic Disney syndrome even causes her to accept Ned's invite to a memorial service at his late wife's grave. She sees this as him moving on, and the late Mrs. Ned delivering a blessing from the great beyond, rather than the very obvious catastrophe she's dreamily waltzing into fuzzy wuzzy first. Carrie's dinner with Big comes around, and obviously keen to keep the mood light, she asks him for his opinion on what happens after you die. A shame, really, that the two of them didn't spend the next 20 years discussing what happens just before you die, which might have helped Carrie to remember how to call for an ambulance. Despite almost making it over Big's threshold, Carrie manages to stick to her pledge not to become reacquainted with his mutton javelin. But she does squeeze in a little melodrama by doing a flouncing run away from him, so I suppose the night isn't a total loss for her. Miranda's lurking around her new apartment taking measurements, likely to make sure that her full jigsaw killer setup will fit through the doorways. As she leaves, she has everybody's least favourite experience when the reanimated corpse of her new neighbour comes bounding out into the hallway to introduce herself. She's horrified when said neighbour wastes no time in telling her that the previous occupant, Ruthie, died somewhere in the apartment. Unmarried, undiscovered for a week, and with a fair amount of her face halfway through her cat's large intestine. Later, after getting her own cat's hopes up by almost choking on a wayward piece of Chinese food, Miranda suffers an unexpected, forever alone related panic attack which lands her in the emergency room. I'll leave it up to you whether you believe it's genuine or the start of building an insanity defense she can deploy if anyone ever smells what's hidden behind her walls. FYI, Miranda later just decides to get over her panic disorder, demonstrating beyond all reasonable doubt that this show has about as tight a grip on mental health issues as Samantha's panty elastic does on her hips. Speaking of, Samantha asks for help with getting unpariahed from influential socialite and amazing namehaver Shippy Shipman. Unfortunately, Shippy is another scorned woman Samantha has left in her randy wake. As a result, Shippy is less interested in restoring Samantha's reputation than she is in tying her to the back of a town car and going for the high score across the Brooklyn Bridge. Back graveside in Queens, Charlotte joins Ned for the memorial service. Except, it turns out that she's one of several women helping him through his grief with their triangular whisker fish. For some reason, Ned invites all four of them to the same service, like he's running an Avengers initiative for naive women. After a quick token beating with a bunch of lilies, Charlotte moves on. In a completely bizarre example of Deus Ex Machina, which the show thinks it sidesteps by directly acknowledging, Samantha's attempt to pay her dues by physically helping to build Javier House is rewarded when she meets Leonardo DiCaprio. Except, it isn't Leonardo DiCaprio, it's a man who looks absolutely nothing like him without enough silhouette to cover that fact up. In any case, we're asked to not just suspend our disbelief, but fire it into orbit by buying that befriending him delivers her back into the good graces of NYC's social elite. When Big shows up at Carrie's place, she declines to explain why she's been dodging his calls and instead takes him bowling, apparently because it's the least sexual thing she can think of. Clearly, she hasn't seen John Goodman in The Big Lebowski. This time, she eventually makes it through Big's front door and they spend the night together. There's no real rhyme, reason, or chemistry to it, and as far as we know, he'd still rather roll naked through a pit of scorpions than commit. But I suppose if it's a choice between Big and dying alone, I'd still rather buy a lifetime subscription to Cat Lady Monthly and sterilise myself in a scalding hot bath. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this week's episode, then please leave a like to let me know, subscribe for more every week, and if you can, share these videos so that we can all at least have something playing in the background while our cats eat our corpses. Last week, I asked you whether Miranda and Charlotte were justified in their fakery or should have been honest from the start. Commenter Don Solo gets it, arguing that it was a natural reaction to Carrie making it look like being single too long turns you into the polyps from The Little Mermaid. And extra points for never letting Miranda off with anything ever. As well you shouldn't. And I couldn't go on without mentioning Ree's literally blisteringly real comment this week where she proposes that faking it is sometimes a necessary evil to escape from chafing and misery. Better stock up on the Vaseline just in case. This week I'm asking, was a fear of dying young, dumb and starved of cum really a good enough justification for Carrie to get back with Big, or was it just the convenient excuse she'd been waiting for? Answers in the comments below please, and the best will make an appearance next week. Either way, thanks for watching, and as ever, if you can't be good, be crusty.